Good day. Welcome to Lecture 2. Today we begin the unit, the Disaster Management Planning Process. As previously done, this lesson will be presented in two parts. So let us begin with a definition of disaster management. If you recall the previous lesson, we looked at a definition of disaster. And a disaster was defined as a calamitous event having negative or harmful impacts on human life, the environment, and the property. Those are three major impacts that you need to remember. Disaster management takes the definition even further. With disaster management, we look at the organization and the management of the resources and responsibilities that would be required in addressing any emergencies related to disaster. Some of the areas that you would look at would be the emergency itself. How do we prepare for it? How do we respond to it? And after the emergency period, what would be needed for the recovery process? So disaster management looks at the preparation for all of these phases. Disaster management, as mentioned, requires a lot of pre-planning, a lot of upfront planning. Even in terms of the other phases, in terms of addressing the emergencies, if you recall, an emergency is that intense period right at the beginning of the onset of a disaster. You must be prepared ahead of time. Monitoring any approaching disaster also requires pre-planning. A lot of resources and equipment would have to be put in place prior to any of these disasters occurring. Prediction and early warning is also very important as part of the planning process. For example, you would have the onset of a hurricane. We're all familiar with that one. You would have to have equipment in place, for example, your satellite tracking system. Once you know that a hurricane is on its way, you would need to have a system in place to send out early warnings so that communities at risk would know they need to start preparing. If evacuation is required, early warning needs to be carried out to facilitate evacuation. And then we also have periods of damage assessment that would be required after the emergency period has passed. And pre-planning needs to be done in order to facilitate disaster assessment or damage assessment. Relief management, you also need to prepare ahead of time for that. Relief would include things like emergency food supplies, water, emergency shelters, etc. And again, I'm sure you can appreciate the amount of upfront planning that would have to be carried out in order to facilitate all these important tasks. Here we have a very nice and simple schematic of the four major disaster management phases. And please note that you have a continuous cycle occurring here. It's very difficult for you to actually separate any one of these phases, but we will start first at the response phase. As mentioned before, response would be the actions that would be taken during an emergency, that emergency period, to save lives, property, and the environment. Once the response has occurred, the next phase you would have to be dealing with would be the recovery phase. During the recovery phase, this is where actions are taken after the emergency period has passed with the aim of restoring and resuming all normal operations. So we're talking about trying to bring life back to normal as best as possible and as quickly as possible. For example, if there needs to be structural repairs to buildings and infrastructure, bring businesses and other industrial activity back to normal operations, etc. Additionally, during periods of non-emergency, you would want to have apply your mitigation measures wherever possible, and this usually involves efforts to reduce the effects or the risks associated with hazard. In order to do that, usually you would have to have historical data. You would need to have information about at-risk communities to know what the risks are in order to be able to build the resilience of any community against these disasters. For example, if a community is prone to flooding, you may find that you would want to help reduce the chances of flooding by possibly, let's say, building levees along riverbanks, raising the riverbanks to prevent the overflow of the water. But as mentioned before, preparedness or that preparation stage will have to take place prior to any of these other phases, and even during and after. And these actions often take place prior, or as I mentioned, even after any emergency, to facilitate all of those stages that we mentioned: response, recovery, and mitigation. Now let's look at the planning team. For any disaster management planning, it is critical to have a well-equipped and a well-qualified planning team in order to prepare for any disaster. The disaster management, as mentioned before, it is a systematic process that involves oftentimes many different regions, geographic regions, administrative regions. It would require different professionals and persons from different technical and scientific fields all coming together to bring their expertise to the table. Disaster management is important for sustainable development on several levels: the human, the society, and the nature level. If you recall, sustainable development is required, is an important part of the planning process, and disaster management is a critical component of this. Sustainable development involves the human interaction with your natural environment in a wise and balanced manner, so as to ensure the minimal abuse and depletion of your natural resources for future generations. So with that in mind, we often see that disasters, when you are unprepared for a disaster can literally decimate an entire environment. If you recall, this is what happened recently with Antigua and Barbuda and the hurricane that passed through, almost destroying the island of Barbuda. This is a schematic of Trinidad and Tobago's National Response Framework. The disaster management teams can be clearly seen in this schematic, this chart here, where you can see the various ministries that are involved in the various phases of the disaster management process. If you follow me at the top here, we see early warning, which would occur prior to the event, assessment, damage assessment after the event. You would also see emergency operations, and oftentimes you find, depending on the severity of the event, you may find that the President of Trinidad and Tobago may be required to declare a disaster, and also there would be the relief phase, and these are many of the organizations and agencies involved. So let's look quickly here. For example, early warning, we have the Meteorological Office that deals with hurricanes and meteorological issues. Seismic Research Unit at the University of the West Indies that would deal with geological activities such as earthquakes. Police and Fire Services, Ministry of Health, etc., all depending on the nature of the emergency or the disaster itself. Please note the media and the public also play an important role in early warning. In terms of damage assessment, some of the agencies involved would be municipal corporations, for example, and they actually play a very, very critical role. If you recall, in recent years, Trinidad and Tobago often deal with a lot of flooding disasters, and usually with the flooding disasters, municipal corporations would be one of your first responders. They would often, when necessarily, be assisted by the military, Coast Guard, or Air Guard, depending on the nature or the extent of the emergency. Similarly, emergency operations would involve many of these same agencies. Municipal corporation is here again: police service, defense force, health services, fire services, works and transport, etc. Ministry of Foreign Affairs may play a role depending on the scale of the emergency. If the emergency scale goes beyond that of the national capabilities to handle the emergency, then the Ministry of Foreign Affairs would get involved by reaching out to other nations and international organizations. Similarly, we have some of the same agencies involved in the relief response. Ministry of Housing, Ministry of Community Development, municipal corporations, again Ministry of Foreign Affairs involvement, and Ministry of Finance, depending on the scale of the emergency. Also, you would find at times like these, non-governmental organizations, faith-based organizations, and community-based organizations would also get involved at this stage. As mentioned before, a diverse planning team is critical to the response and the management of any disaster. For example, it provides more assistance to accomplish the task. You have increased manpower. It involves more people who have a vested interest in the plan. So if you are part of it, you want to see it succeed. You would put your best foot forward. You would put all your best resources forward. By having a multidisciplinary team, it enhances problem-solving capabilities. You have persons coming from different backgrounds with different experiences, different expertise, and therefore they can bring their different viewpoints to the table to have a comprehensive, holistic plan. In other words, it draws upon the expertise of the various persons involved. What are some of the team rules? We would look at these very briefly. As mentioned before, we know there would be fire services. So the fire department, their purpose and function would be fire suppression, investigation, rescue, warning, etc. Law enforcement agencies such as the police would be involved at the scene of the emergency for security, warning. So that would be, for example, warning and crowd control to keep people safe and away from the area of the emergency. Search and rescue, crowd control, traffic control, etc. Emergency management or civil protection agencies, they would be involved in mitigation, preparedness, response and recovery planning. For example, our regional corporations or municipal corporations would usually be involved on a local level across Trinidad and Tobago to facilitate these activities. Emergency medical services, EMS, or sometimes known as EMTs. These teams provide specialized medical care which is often needed at the scene of the disaster. These personnel are usually highly trained professionals, and they are equipped to go beyond the basics. And when I say basics, I mean I'm describing general first aid as basics, and these are the persons who are usually responsible for assisting to ensure the preservation of life until they are able to transport the casualties to hospitals for medical treatment. The military would also have an important role, and firstly because they have a secure budget. They have a secure budget. And they are usually highly trained in a number of different areas. They can provide the kind of manpower that is necessary at the scene to support any of the various teams out there. For example, they can provide support to the fire services, they can provide support to the police, etc. Engineering support where necessary. In addition to the various teams that would be involved, a number of resources would be required in order to manage any disaster, and one critical resource would be that of information. Information is necessary for anything, managing any situation. You need information to understand the nature of the problem, the characteristics of the area, the persons involved, so every type of information possible would be an assistance. This information can usually be provided through what we call clearinghouses. In other words, there would usually be, in these kind of disaster emergencies, there would usually have to be one agency that provides the facility to handle and manage the inflow and outflow of all information. This information would involve the storage and management of all relevant data and all information that all the persons and organizations involved would need in order to manage the disaster effectively. Human resources would be needed. The required manpower should be a variety of combination of skills, as we've already mentioned, the different team players, the different contributions they would have to make, their skills, the resources, etc. will have to come into play. Training is another important resource needed for disaster management. All aspects of management requires training of personnel to ensure high levels of efficiency before, during, and after the emergency. High levels of training is critical because if you send out first responders out into the field who are poorly trained, this can often result in a secondary disaster. Equipment is needed, all kinds of equipment. You find that the different teams that would be required to respond to any disaster will have to have different types of equipment depending on their function on the scene. For example, you will require fire suppression equipment that would involve certain types of vehicles, trucks, tractors, boats, airplanes, helicopters, and they will have to be prepared for these fire incidents occurring in any number of environments, whether it is on land, whether it is on sea, whether it is accessible by road or only by air. Other devices that they would need would be things like fire extinguishers, hoses, imaging devices. Imaging devices would often be needed to see where fires may be occurring in areas that they cannot visually see. Chemicals, they would need to be ready with chemicals such as wet chemicals for commercial kitchen fires in commercial kitchens. Access equipment, the fire services would often be required to assist in not only reaching fires but in search and rescue. Other types of equipment may be required in order to support the stabilization of collapsing buildings or mines. So we're talking about structures collapsing. Those can be a disaster as well. Some of the things they would need would be vehicles and tools for extracting victims, digging, cutting, spreading, etc. They would also need imaging devices, listening and locating devices, something as simple as trained detection animals. Other types of specialized medical care devices, for example, if they have to go into confined spaces, they would need medical equipment. Medical equipment they would need must be easy to carry, it must be easily portable. Sometimes they would need tools, they would need other types of medical emergency equipment, lighting in that kind of environment, and they would also have to be prepared with their own personal protective equipment. The purpose of personal protective equipment is designed to protect the responder themselves from any life-threatening hazard. Some of these PPE will include fire suppression gear, containment equipment if it's a container spill, a chemical spill, if it is to contain a fire, etc., and cleanup equipment, etc. These are some examples of PPE that may be required. Medical care equipment may also be required. There are times that the scale of the disaster and the scale of the emergency would be really large. Many times you will find in such circumstances they will require mass casualty victim transport vehicles to transport casualties to emergency care facilities. They will need vehicles to transport large numbers of medical officials, nurses, doctors. Mobile and field hospitals and morgues may be required when the scale of the emergency is even larger, that it's not feasible to transport casualties to the hospital. Now they have to take everything out into the field. Large amounts of pharmaceuticals would need to be stockpiled and transported, as well as other types of medical equipment. As mentioned before, information is a critical part of the disaster management process. But information without a means of disseminating that information can be a problem. Therefore, you must have communication systems in place. So that communication system will facilitate the gathering of the information as well as the dissemination of the information. In other words, information in and information out. Some very simple examples would include radios, telephones, various types of telephones such as landlines, cellular phones, and satellite phones, your basic fax machine, email, etc. Also related to the dissemination of information would be the need for public warning and alert systems. This type of system is intended to communicate between the public and the first responders, as public awareness is necessary to mitigate the effects of the disaster. So the public or the communities at risk in particular, they need to know what is going on. They need information so that they can take necessary measures to secure their own safety, the safety of their families, their property, etc. And some of the means by which this is done would be public emergency reporting systems such as 999, 990, weather radios, sirens and public announcements or PA systems, signage. You also have examples of internet-based warning systems. And then of course we have disaster public information systems such as provided by ODPM. Other types of support equipment that may also be needed would be disaster feeding. Remember we mentioned these types of facilities will require pre-planning, so stockpiling of food may be necessary so that in times of emergency food relief can be provided. Many times shelter might need to be provided. Environmental testing where there is an environmental disaster. Equipment will need to be available for environmental testing. Storage of many of these resources would be critical. Transportation, for example, there may be a need for vehicles and temporary infrastructure such as temporary bridges to facilitate movement from one region to another, particularly if a high risk area or if a disaster area has become blocked off. Equipment and resources would need to get into those areas. Imaging devices, as mentioned before, these are often used in search and rescue as well. And then, of course, there is damage and needs assessment that would have to be done after the emergency has passed. So at this point, I ask you to please continue to part 2 of this lesson.